Hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Saudi Arabia is facing an uncertain future. Its dramatic economic reform program is in question as COVID-19 has caused oil prices to plummet. It's embroiled in a long-term war in neighbouring Yemen, and the kingdom's heir apparent has launched a wave of repression against would-be opponents. Once upon a time, the kingdom was seen as a rock of stability in the Middle East. All that now seems to have gone. Just where is the country headed? We have two guests today to try and answer that question. They are Neil Quilliam, an Associate Fellow with Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa programme, and Karim Fahim, the Middle East editor of The Washington Post. Karim, unfortunately, has been waylaid, but he's hoping to join us by phone very shortly. But Neil is with us. Neil, where are you joining us from?
Battersea in London.
Very good. Thank you very much for your time. If you've got questions, anyone, please do put them in the box at the bottom. There's a Q&A box just there. So please do just put your question in there. And also do stay on for the end of the hour when we have our own discussion. If you just want to share your views, please raise your hand or pop a question in and we'll come to you. Isabel will open your microphone so you can talk. Neil, I think there are three areas to this discussion, and put me right if I've got it wrong, but possibly the economy, the move away from oil, and then the political framework. That's the question of the succession within the kingdom, and also the political reforms. And then lastly, the regional aspects in terms of the power struggle with Iran, and of course, as we've mentioned, the war in Yemen. So there's an awful lot there to discuss, but let's just try and set the context, if you like, with the challenges taking place with Saudi Arabia's economy and in terms of what's happening with oil. I'll leave it to you to lead the discussion, and then we'll just go back and forth.
Sure, thank you, and thank you very much for sort of hosting me today. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation and discussion. I mean, as you've said, you've alluded to the sort of three key areas, and there is a lot going on in Saudi Arabia. So let's sort of try to unpick it. It'll be quite complicated within a space of an hour just to sort of really dive deep. But let's see where we can go. In a way, I mean, one can't start talking about Saudi Arabia these days without talking about Mohammed bin Salman, and we'll call him MBS for short, and his sort of aim or goal to transform the economy or transition the economy away from oil dependency towards a non-oil future. That's encapsulated in Vision 2030, and that is a vehicle that by and large has got significant buy-in from the youthful population. We're all familiar with the sort of statistics and the demographics. Something in a region of sort of 70% are under 25 and 65% are under 20. So there's a young and sort of vibrant, I guess, if you want, youth that are sort of buying into this project. For a lot of us who've been looking at the country for a very long time, you would sort of see our eyes roll when MBS came and said, we're going to diversify the economy, we're going to shift away from the oil-based economy, and we're going to develop and move in a very different direction. I studied my Middle East politics courses in the mid-90s, and at that point we were looking back to sort of the late 70s and looking at diversification efforts that had by and large failed. I've sort of lived in the kingdom at various points. I was there in 99, 2000, that was one of my kind of times, and the oil price hit $10 a barrel. And I remember at the time there was a big push towards diversification, a big push towards reform. And of course, as and when the oil cycle booms and busts, as the price rises, the appetite for reform has, to a large extent, sort of diminished because it's suddenly the urgency has shifted, or the focus, the priority has changed. However, until sort of coronavirus, until this oil price war, where we saw the price of oil really falling and actually going into negative value, it did look as though MBS and those around him were very much committed to sort of forging and pushing ahead with these quite deep and profound changes there's a high cost to be paid, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But there did seem to be that commitment. But now, in light of where we are with the oil price, although there is some kind of rebound, and the pain that coronavirus has brought, not just on the kingdom, obviously, but on the global economy, this poses a real challenge and a real test to see whether that appetite, that desire to sort of forge ahead and push to a non-oil economy is really there, or whether they really have that capacity to do so. It's a pivotal moment, I think, for Vision 2030.
Oh, my fault. Sorry, chaps. Entirely my fault. Sorry.
So I would say it's a pivotal moment for Vision 2030 at the moment, and this is a sort of suck it and see moment. I guess we're all observing and seeing what direction this is going to take the kingdom.
And I'm just thinking that okay, again, I guess the next thing is the succession. And could you just give us a bit of background to Mohammed bin Sultan and how he's become the heir apparent? We obviously know about the controversies surrounding him more recently, but just give us a bit of background about him.
Sure. So he is, I guess he's the preferred. He seems to be the favored son of King Salman. Salman became king. He succeeded Abdullah, who was his half brother, in 2015. And when King Salman, formerly Crown Prince Salman, held office, his son Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, really sort of became gatekeeper to the then Crown Prince's office. And by and large, he wasn't a particularly well-known figure, certainly not amongst the sort of the business or the political community or the diplomatic community. He wasn't one of the sort of well-known princes where, the spotlight had shone on him for some time. And a lot of us sort of Saudi watchers had been looking at various younger members of the family that were sort of beginning to percolate up, members of the different cadet branches. And in all honesty, I don't think any of us saw him. I think we just thought, well, he's a bit of a kind of a country hick. He's never really studied externally outside, has no known profile. So his sort of rise came as quite a surprise, I think. And he has sort of come, not from the shadows, because that's to paint him as a shady character, but almost come from nowhere, or this, this preferred son of Salman, to be appointed as defense minister, deputy crown prince. Then Salman effected a significant and major change by removing Mohammed bin Nayef, whom we'd all assumed at some point who had been crown prince would become king. There was this real shift, and MBS was pushed into this position, or pulled into this position. So almost from, not obscurity, because that's too harsh, but from not having a very large public profile, and certainly not an outwardly impressive profile, he was Minister of Defense. I mean, he was in an extremely strong position, and then became Crown Prince. And we've seen some significant and profound changes since he's occupied both those positions.
Before we come on to the question of the sort of the more repressive aspects of his role, could you talk about the expectations of young Saudis? You talked about that incredibly young population. What is the vision? What is Vision 2030 is partly about the overall economy, but what's it suggesting is possible to that very young population?
So, I mean, the fascinating thing with this really is that MBS did not really have a core constituency within the family. There weren't those members of the family, the wider family, that he could pick up the phone and he could really sort of draw them into his decision-making circle. He didn't have those relationships like the other princes of his similar generation, or indeed the more senior princes. And what he's done with his Vision 2030 is appeal directly to a new constituency and see a younger generation that is tired of the old ways in which the country is run. I mean, that's really simplifying it there. It's obviously a lot more complex than that. But he's very much kind of sold them a vision that this country is going to shift away from oil. the terms of the social contract, I mean, he's never really discussed that in those terms, but the terms of the social contract is going to shift. You're going to have to get out and work. You're going to have to pay taxes. But as a part of that, we're going to open up the social space. We're going to really put our energy and efforts behind developing the private sector. This kingdom is now on this path to a critical and essential transition. And I want you all to be part of that. Now, sort of being based in a Chatham House here in London, and also just having our own sort of networks. I mean, we speak to young Saudis, particularly the Western educated Saudis, all the time. And I have to say, irrespective of, some of the misadventures, there is still this kind of great hope or optimism and faith that he will deliver on these reforms. 2030 is obviously massively, massively ambitious, I guess, as in any government plans. And a lot of it just will not be met. But the sort of the core, the rump of it is still very attractive, still very appealing to young people.
So what kind of changes have young people seen? I mean, we obviously know that there's been a lot of noise about women driving, for example, some more freedom to travel. And you talked about sort of entertainment as well and trying to give a greater sense of freedom. But what real changes have people seen in the past 2-3 years?
I mean, I think those are real changes. And those, it's, as a sort of Western academic or Western policy analyst, we would often, think about those as being cosmetic changes. But in fact, as somebody who's visited the kingdom on many occasions, over the past 2 or 3 years, even when you just arrive in the country, there's a very, very different feel, where there is the social space is opening up. Women are now able to work in many more professions. There are still some professions where they still can't work, but a lot of that kind of space has opened up. There's a recognition that entrepreneurs can play a role in driving change. I mean, it's almost that's. It depends who you speak to, and most of the people, analysts like I would speak to, for instance, are sort of Western educated, English speaking. I mean, we do speak Arabic, but they're a kind of a more compliant audience, if you like, and they are urban dwellers. It's much harder to sort of see where some of those changes are taking place out in the sticks, out in the provinces. I mean, the removal or the sort of sending back to barracks of the moral police, for example, is massive. I mean, women.
Just explain that again, because some people may not be aware of that. What they've had a role in Saudi society since 1930 or so,
yes.
and enforced the religious code, and they have a serious amount of influence.
Absolutely. I mean, they're not a formal part of the police force, but they are seen absolutely. I mean, moral police is probably the best way of kind of translating it. They are there to make sure that Saudi citizens and expatriates or visitors conform to the expectations or the moral or ethical codes that are strictly adhered to and strictly enforced. So that could mean men and women not being able to meet, women showing a bit of their hair. I mean, there are all sorts of things. And previously, I mean, they could be quite a menace on the streets. And not to trivialize it, but they could pursue you and hit you with sticks, and then they could detain you. Ultimately, it would be the police that would have to prosecute or charge you. But the mutawa or mutawin, the religious police, had a considerable amount of power and authority on the streets. Their removal has really sort of opened up that space. So the feeling of freedom in social spaces, the ability now, I mean, the last time I was in Riyadh was about 4 or 5 months ago. I mean, for the first time ever, I went to an Italian restaurant where there were men and women just mixing openly. Women didn't have to wear the abaya or the scarf. There was music playing. I mean, music has not been, for the large part, allowed in public spaces. So we could call that cosmetic, or we could call that superficial. But for young people, at least, this this feels very, very real. This
So
feels
in a way, there's a real disconnect between the perceptions here. Our perception of this kingdom in crisis, this young pariah, if you like, who's leading the kingdom in the wrong direction, yet these internal reforms that are really having a very strong, whether you want to call it superficial or not, it's actually quite a dramatic effect internally. And there's a sort of disconnect between our perceptions and what's going on internally.
I mean, I think so, but there's a sort of there's a longevity. No, there's a shelf life, if you like, to how long this dimension, this aspect of the reforms can actually continue to benefit. So the sort of constituency that I see when I go to Saudi or I meet here in London would say, we like the reforms, we're very comfortable with the reforms that are taking place. However, there are now a number of misadventures that make us feel very, very uncomfortable. We don't like this at all. This is starting to, they talk about, an autocratic system, an authoritarian system. And the conversation that I often have when I'm there is, can these reforms be reversed? Have they reached a point of no return? And that's something we sort of probe at quite a lot.
In a moment, I'm going to ask you about that repression. Obviously, I think most of us are going to be aware about what happened in 2017 and Mohammed bin Sultan really locking up anybody he saw as a competitor or a threat to his authority. And that had sent dramatic shockwaves throughout the kingdom. And I want you to talk in a second a bit about what's been happening more recently in the last few weeks even. What I'd like to do is bring also, we've got William Patey, Sir William Patey, who is Britain's former ambassador, or Britain's ambassador to Saudi Arabia, who's here with us as well. And Isabel, if you could just bring him in, and then he can join us as a panelist. And I know William's got some questions, but also I'd love to get William's views as well while we're here. But let's, Neil, just bring us up to date while William's being brought online here. Just bring us up to date with what's been happening in the last few weeks.
The country's been in lockdown, exactly in the same way that we have here in the UK. Lockdown has started to ease, but there was concern about second wave coming. So they, in Jeddah there were some of the restrictions. In Riyadh, some of the restrictions have been reimposed. But of course, the challenge for the kingdom really is to manage its economy and manage this this dip in the oil price. And the question that we all need to answer or think about is, oil is very cyclical. Oil economies are very cyclical. But are we in the process of seeing a more structural change in the global economy? My answer would be no. But are we seeing a more structural change in the global economy, which will set a significant and deep challenge to the country and to its leadership? Okay. I would probably argue, maybe, I'm sure Sir William will have points on this, but I think the kingdom's actually in a position, as and when global oil demand starts to pick up. In fact, because US oil shale has been somewhat decimated for the time being, I think Saudi Arabia is in a position to really actually improve its economy.
Right. Okay. I've got some bad news in that Kareem Fahim has got a small sort of family crisis, and I've just got a note. He's not going to be able to join us, which is very unfortunate. But I'm delighted to have Sir William Patey here with us. Sir William, just as by way of a reminder, can you just tell everybody when you were ambassador in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I was ambassador from 2007 to 2010, but I overlapped with Neil a bit. I was the deputy ambassador from 1995 to 1998. So I too remember when GDP was 100%, debt to GDP ratio was 100%, and oil was down at $8 to $10 a barrel. So when Saudi Arabia had no money. So two very different periods.
And in terms of, I just want to try and give us some perspective. Saudi Arabia has been talking about economic reform for a very long period of time, but you obviously give this current shift credence? You know, you think this is a very realistic drive and something that is going to take place?
Well, I mean, what is happening is something that people have been arguing over for 20, 30 years, that Saudi Arabia needed to diversify, it needed to create jobs for young Saudis, it needed to lessen its dependence on oil. So it's been an aim of, in a sense, Saudi government policy, a declared aim of Saudi government policy for as long as one can remember. But the consensus system that used to be in place before Mohammed bin Salman took over always managed to slow it down. Decision making was very slow in Saudi Arabia. It required a lot of people to agree. And as Neil has already said, sometimes once even reform had kicked in, when the money started flowing again, there was always an excuse to reverse the reform. So the civil service was bloated again, the pay went up, and Saudi Arabia was overly reliant on the state paying for everything through the oil. So that's always been a sort of cyclical thing. I mean, it may be, so the direction of travel of MBS, whatever you think about his autocratic style, is certainly one that most commentators most economists, most consultants would have said was the right one. Indeed, part of his blueprint comes straight out the McKinsey Booz Allen playbook. They've made a lot of money in consulting for Saudi Arabia. And as Neil has said, the question is, can they do it? I agree with Neil that the Saudi Arabia may come out of this as an oil producer, may come out of this slightly stronger than other oil producers. I think there's the possibility that its market share of a declining market could increase, because as Neil says, these current levels have killed off the shale production in the US. A lot of people there were teetering. So there'll be a lot of marginal production that will disappear. You know, the BPs and Shells of the world are not investing in some of the more marginal fields. They're shutting in. So in terms of available oil, post when the world comes out of the COVID depression, Saudi Arabia may emerge in a stronger position, but not so strong that it can afford to give up on the 2030. And all the reforms that Neil was talking about may seem trivial and obvious to us, but they begin to give you a vision of a Saudi society that is capable of accepting tourists. And tourism is the one part of the economy that is undeveloped in Saudi Arabia, apart from religious tourism to the Hajj and Umrah, but it's an undeveloped part of the economy. And most countries in the world have a sort of tourism industry up in the 15-17% of GDP, and that would be so. That's a huge area that is untapped by Saudi Arabia and is capable of providing lots of opportunities for small and medium-sized Saudi enterprises. That's always been the problem. Saudi Arabia is run by family-owned firms or big state conglomerates. Mm-hmm. There isn't a lot of space for young entrepreneurial middle-class Saudis to make their money. So, if the service sector opens up, if cinemas open up, if restaurants open up, if clubs open up, if resorts open up, you can see there's a whole range of opportunity there for Saudi. So, internally, the direction of travel is absolutely clear, and the putting of the Matawain, the moral police, back in their box is a key part of the strategy.
Yeah. I was just reading in The Economist, 60% of people employed are employed by the state. So it's a lot's got to happen. I'm just going to go back and then come on to our sort of third section, which is the regional issues, what's going on in Yemen and the relationship with Iran. So I'll come to you on that, Neil. I'm going to be very unfair on you, William. Is there a way of putting your laptop on a table or something, just so that we can get...
All right, I'll move. I was relaxing on my couch. I didn't expect to be...
I know we sprung this on you, so this is...
Yeah, you just said to me, join, just jog in and it'll be interesting, so here I am. I'm going to... Is that better?
We sprung it on you, and that's very unfair.
I'll move to my usual webinar place as opposed to lounging on my couch.
No, that's great. Ax, thank you very much. Neil, so Yemen, the war in Yemen has been going on for 8 or 9 years, is it? Is it as long as that?
5 years. 5 years.
5 years. And arguably, Iran has come out very, very well on this, and Saudi Arabia is suing for peace with a very poor hand.
Yeah, actually, if I can be really cheeky, I mean, I think Sir William is probably better placed to answer this on Yemen, given his former diplomatic career. If he's happy to take that, I mean, I'm happy to do so, but I respect that he's probably in a better position than me.
Right, well, go on if you're happy to do that, William. Do you want to do that?
Well, yes. Well, I mean, I wouldn't quite characterize it just as you said. You know, Iran's winning and Saudi Arabia is desperate. For Saudi Arabia, this is an existential issue for them to have an unstable state on its huge southern border over which it has very little influence, or indeed which is possibly a threat to them, which currently the Houthis are. I think they've created an opportunity for Iran. I don't think. I think Iran was kind of delivered an opportunity here, which they have exploited to the full. The Saudis would like to get out of Yemen because it's impacting on their relationships with Europe and with the United States and arms sales and all of that. And the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, because they are leading the coalition against the Houthis, they own the humanitarian crisis. And it's, you know, that's part of the image you talked earlier about Saudi Arabia. So they would like to get out. They would like to promote a peace deal, and they are talking to the Houthis. There's lots of back channels. There's lots of direct talks going through the UN. But the problem is, it's hard to see what the political settlement in Yemen would look like at the moment. You know, you've got the Houthis in control of the northwest. You've got divisions in the south. You've got the increasingly feeble al-Hadi government, the official government of Yemen, being challenged by the STC, which is the southern secessionists who want to divide Yemen into two. They're being backed by the Emiratis. So you've got divisions within the Saudi-led coalition. You've got the Houthis, who have much larger territory than they could traditionally hold. So it's very difficult to see what the settlement is. But Saudi Arabia certainly would like to promote a peace settlement, would certainly like to disentangle itself, but it can't afford Yemen to become a completely failed state in which Al-Qaeda already operate there, the possibility of Daesh or ISIS establishing a foothold there, and the possibility of that state just collapsing and being a fertile ground a la Somalia. They couldn't afford Yemen to be Somalia. It's just too close. It's too long a border. So it's existential for them. They've got themselves into their Vietnam, frankly, and they would like to sort of withdraw gracefully, but retain some influence. So it's a very difficult problem for them.
Yeah, and so can anyone put a cost on it? Do you know what the expenditure has been? I'm presuming that's sort of drawn money away from their own economy as well.
Many billions. I don't know if they've done a calculation, but it will be many billions of dollars.
Yeah,
tens of billions.
Okay, I think it's time, everyone. You want to put your questions down, so just start writing your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll come to them. And then in the meantime, Neil, what was the backlash after 2017, and what has been the international reaction to to Saudi Arabia since then? At that point, the CIA clearly said that the Saudis had killed Khashoggi, and there was people pulled away from the summit in Saudi at the same time. There seemed to be a sense that, golly, we really can't get involved here. What's the situation now in terms of international investment and investment attitudes towards Saudi Arabia?
Well, I mean, I think there was an event that preceded, Khashoggi as well, which had probably a detrimental impact on FDI flows and investment in the kingdom, and that was, the detention of very senior princes in the Ritz-Carlton. This act, was probably by many young Saudis seen quite positively, because it was seen as sort of picking up the old cronies and trying to root out corruption. That, clearly picking up leading members of the family, leading businessmen, former and in fact current serving ministers, sent a real shockwave through to investors and businesses operating in the kingdom. And I don't think it's really recovered from that, from an investment perspective. I mean, I think that was indicative at the time that MBS was in the process of not only consolidating political power in his hands, but consolidating economic power. Who knows how much they raised from that kind of shakedown? I mean, 100 billion was a figure that came out, and that's often banded around. I'm not sure if it was anywhere near that. I somehow doubt it. But that that sort of the rule of law, the development of the business environment, improving the regulatory system. We've seen parts of that as part of Vision 2030, and there has been significant progress. But the fact that political risk has suddenly kind of gone through the roof remains a major concern for businesses operating there, because we've seen from a series of decisions that seem to rest with MBS. I'll get onto Khashoggi in a minute. That he can almost turn on a dime. So there's great uncertainty there, and that obviously presents a risk to business. With the murder of Khashoggi, I mean, if we sort of wind back a little bit before that, I mean, MBS had a very successful visit to the US. He had a very successful visit to the UK, and his sort of transition plan, his Vision 2030, was really being sort of fated by media, by politicians, by the business community. I mean, tongue in cheek, but I mean, The Guardian wrote some quite nice pieces about Saudi Arabia, which that hadn't happened for quite a long time. And then Khashoggi comes along, and that just derails everything. Suddenly, that this idea that he's an enlightened reformer, or he might be a slightly autocratic reformer, but if we look at the direction of travel, the general good, the country is going to benefit from that. That just suddenly was obviously called into question. Now, so the event that you're talking about, sort of Davos in the desert, as it were, the investment initiative, that particular year was a disaster, a PR disaster, although lots of Chinese and Russians showed up. But last November was the following iteration, and I attended that. I mean, it wasn't particularly well organized, but the room was full again. I mean, the Davos in the desert there were reportedly 6,000 people flew in to attend that. So I felt that particular moment, it's not all being forgotten, but I just felt that a sufficient time had almost passed where people were now willing to sort of go back and look at the kingdom and think, okay, maybe there's been no contrition, but maybe now's the time we have to deal with this country.
I've had several people write in here and ask about how was that event viewed internally. I remember watching some of the Saudi media coverage at the time, and they're obviously arguing very much in favor of MBS and saying, he had to make these moves, and both in terms of what was going on in the hotel early in 2017, although I think there's less coverage about that, but certainly in terms of Khashoggi, in terms of him being seen as an enemy of the state, and they had to go, and it was an operation that went wrong. How that was some of the coverage at the time, but how do you think people, like ordinary people, perceived what he was doing then? What was the internal?
I think there was shock. Khashoggi in particular, with the Ritz-Carlton, there was probably a bit of a sense of, well, these guys deserved it. They've been ripping us off for decades. A little bit of the sort of Schadenfreude would have been there. With Khashoggi, I mean, with my own kind of contacts, who are sort of fairly well positioned within the kingdom, there was real profound shock. And it was a moment, a real moment for pause. It was like, wow, is this what we've signed up to? Where does this lead? What comes next? But then, sort of on reflection, if you like, there was, well, he's the only horse in town. We've got there's nothing. Do we go back to these 70, 80-year-olds who are basically going to bring zero reform, or it's going to be snail pace? Is there anybody else that can deliver these reforms? Does he have a brother? Yes, he does have a brother, but there's nobody else really when he looks around. Also because he got rid of them more politically. There's nobody to deliver it. So it's like, okay, well, this is it. This is the only game in town. We'll hold our nose and we've got to go along with this.
Yeah. Isabel, if you could bring up Hilary Matthews in a second so we could take a question from her in a second. If we bring up Hilary in just a second. But before we go to that, Sir William, what Neil was just saying now seems very apt to me. It's the only game in town. And particularly if we think of the relationship with Iran as well, and Iran being seen as more and more adventurous and particularly after the sort of implosion of Iraq, Iran really becoming a dominant regional power.
Well, Iran is a regional power. I don't think Saudi Arabia's aim is to stop them becoming the dominant regional power. That's their strategic aim. I think that part of the problem for the Saudis is they have up to now relied on the United States, which has always been their absolutely utter reliable anchor on their for the defense, so that any attack by Iran on Saudi Arabia would be defended by the United States, or any attack on Saudi Arabia by anybody would have been defended by the United States, apart from Israel, and Israel was never going to attack Saudi Arabia. But that equation has changed. It started to change with Obama, President Obama, who was looking to withdraw US troops from the Middle East, to no longer be the policeman of the Middle East. That was a trend that was already happening. Now, and the Saudis were very worried about that. And they were worried about the Obama administration tilting towards Iran, being more even-handed between Iran and Saudi Arabia, having a regional balance rather than backing Saudis. With Donald Trump, it's got more complicated. The same kind of withdrawal, the same absence of the US willing to get engaged in big military force. He's continued to withdraw troops, although he withdraws them, sends them back again, withdraws them. You know, he's a bit topsy-turvy and unpredictable. And the Saudis quite like the idea that he was much harder line over on Iran, so therefore he opposed the nuclear deal. The Saudis didn't like that because it only dealt with a nuclear issue, didn't deal with Iranian interference in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, in Bahrain and Iraq and Yemen. And so that's why they wanted the Saudis to push back. But when the Iranians attacked the Abqaiq facility, I think we can accept that it was the Iranians and not the Houthis who attacked the Abqaiq facility. And the Americans basically told the Saudis, well, if you want to retaliate, you're on your own. And that was a bit of a wake-up call for them. And since then, the Americans have become a little bit transactional. When the Americans were having trouble with the Saudi oil policy, amazingly, the Patriot missile systems that had been installed in Saudi Arabia had to be recalled for repair and maintenance. Now, the Americans said it was only about repair and maintenance, but the Saudis were on the phone to Washington immediately to ask, what did this mean? And that would have increased their doubts. So you've got a new strategic balance. The Saudis know, as do the Emiratis, that they're kind of on their own a bit when it comes to regional engagements. Now that worries them. There's not much they can do about it except recognize it and try and hold off the Iranians. It may mean they negotiate with the Iranians at some stage. I think they're kind of waiting, as the Iranians are, to see what happens in the November election. If the Iranians are holding fire on the grounds that they're hoping there won't be a Trump second term, in which case there might be another opportunity to re-engage. If there is a Trump second term, they may want to increase the stakes because they won't want to sit there and be squeezed by maximum pressure. So the region is about as volatile. It's always volatile, but it's this is getting beyond. I used to be a non-executive director of a bank in the Middle East, and we always had inherent political risk which we could do nothing about, which was the geopolitics of the Middle East. And you're getting to a stage where these inherent political risks may be becoming unacceptable. They're getting a little bit higher and a little bit fraught.
Sir William, we were hoping to grab him for a tour in February, which wasn't possible. And each time we try and go, there's another obstacle that seems to be put up in front of us. And the latest one is COVID, obviously. But I'm very much hoping that we'll get there someday.
My visa's still valid till next March.
Yeah, right. Okay. So Hilary, you, I think we've answered some of your questions anyway, but it's worth sort of putting your questions again. And I think particularly whether on the tourism as well. To Hilary, do you want to go ahead, and then we'll see if both William and Neil can take those on. Hilary. Oh, can't hear you. Do you want to just double check your microphone, Hilary? We can't hear you at all at the moment. Hilary, it should be okay. Try talking now. We can't hear you, so I'm going to ask your questions for you. So there are several questions here. So the question was, does Saudi Arabia have any other natural resources that can be developed? Tourism, we've obviously spoken about. And then we've also just spoken about Yemen. Is there any real hope for peace, she says there. Neil, beyond tourism we've spoken about, but what are the key sectors within the economy that could be developed? I mean, services have got a long way to go. Just talk a bit about some of the things that we think are going to happen, and maybe William can chip in there too.
Sure. I mean, to be honest, we're starting from a fairly low base. I mean, oil has been the predominant source of income and revenue for since 1938 and since it was basically discovered. There is a manufacturing base. There are pharmaceuticals they can work in. I mean, part of Vision 2030 is really developing the defense capabilities. In fact, the indigenous defense capabilities. And there's the Saudi Arabian military initiative, which is intended. It's actually a sort of a rip-off or a copy from what the UAE is doing next door. But sort of alluding to William's point, the sort of dependency upon the US is a long-term concern. Well, actually, it's more an immediate concern. So there's an investment certainly in that side. But I mean, tourism. I mean, tourism, as we alluded to, is a big area that it really sort of sees a future. And you've got that whole sort of Red Sea coast there, which is really quite something. Entertainment is another scope and place where you're starting from a very, very large scope. I mean, the thing is in Saudi, and part of its diversification efforts is this continuous shift down into the downstream, into the petrochemical sector, and an integrated service and developing its own capabilities. But again, that's been something that's been mooted and pushed quite slowly since the 1970s, but it's not real diversification. It's just, using hydrocarbons for another form.
Right. Isabel, if you could bring up Jim Lowenstein's microphone while we're waiting. William, do you want to just sort of chip on for the back?
I look to the lower Gulf, the Emirates in Qatar, and I first went to the Middle East on a posting in the Emirates in 1978. So over a sort of 40 odd year time span, the Emirates has expanded hugely in the service sector. And they began, when I first went to the Emirates, you couldn't spend your money in the Emirates because there was nothing to do. And what they've created over the last 40 years is quite a large service sector. Saudi Arabia has a similar opportunity. Most of its services, a lot of their services are imported from outside. So there is scope for the service sector to grow, and I include tourism in that. But beyond tourism, the service, the entertainment business, cafes, restaurants, you name it, hairdressers. What a modern economy has a large service sector. Look in Britain, we're 83% service sector. I think the Saudi service sector is pretty low. So that's an area they could really develop, and that's where that's the significance of the putting the religious police in their box, opening up the economy, liberalizing. That creates opportunity, but it's still going to be tough. Saudi Arabia is not going to suddenly transform itself from an oil-based economy very quickly. If it could grow the service sector by 10% and the tourist sector by 10%, it would be doing wonders. It would be absolutely do wonders.
And particularly for those young people who are looking for jobs or something to do. Whilst we're taking, we're going to take Jim Lowenstein's question in a second. Can we bring up Andy Mendes, because it sort of links into Jim's question as well. So we can bring up Andy Mendes. That'd be great. So Jim, go ahead and ask your question. Jim Lowenstein.
Am I on?
Yep, you're on. Yep.
I wondered what you thought the Saudi reaction will be if Netanyahu goes ahead with his annexation?
Well, I think they'll huff and they'll puff. They'll have to huff and puff. But essentially, they've got an unwritten strategic alliance with Israel. Iran is the biggest threat to Saudi Arabia. Iran is probably the biggest threat to Israel. So there's quite a bit of conversation that goes on between the Saudis and the Israelis via the Americans and more directly about that. Now there are limits. I think the Saudis are perfectly comfortable quietly to abandon the Palestinians, but it's not something they could do easily, because there would still be a strength of feeling within Saudi Arabia. So I think with the rest of the international community, they'll have a lot of support. There'll be a lot of bedfellows, because Israeli annexation of the West Bank would be regarded by most, well, in fact, every country apart from the United States, as illegal and detrimental to the idea of a two-state solution in which Israel would live side by side in security with a Palestinian state. So I think you would find there'd be lots of public statements. But it's quite interesting. MBS at one stage went as far as to accept that Jerusalem could be the capital of Israel. So he was prepared to go quite far. And it was at that stage that his father intervened with a kind of longer perspective, that King Salman actually, one of the few times he's rebuked his son and said this would not be acceptable to Saudi Arabia. So I think MBS will probably regard it as not his main priority, but I think there probably would have to be a bit of there would be certainly some public criticism of such a move.
Let's bring up Andy Mendes. Andy, I know your question's very similar to Jim's, but I think Neil will be able to give some different thoughts as well. So Andy, just put your thoughts down now. Andy.
Okay, I mean, it's based on deep ignorance of the subject, so bear with me. But my question started off on saying, is the relationship with Israel a key to the fact that the West, and especially the States, likes the Saudis and hates the Iranians? So you've sort of answered that, but it's a more general question. Is it, in a sense, the core question, why is it that the Saudis and their supporters are seen to be jolly good things, despite all the catalogue of things that you've talked about that they do badly or that we don't like, whereas the Iranians, who have sort of similar issues, are seen to be the great enemy? And is that an American position that the UK has been told to adopt, or is it also a UK we thought about this first position?
God, I think there are a lot of questions in there. I mean,
yeah, none of them make much sense, but don't worry.
Yeah, British Middle East policy was sort of, set by the, passage to India to start with, but I don't think we want to go back that far.
Well, Andy, I don't think they are stupid questions at all. They're fundamental, and I think the difference is it's not just the Americans. The Iranians since 1979 are seen as a revolutionary power. Before 1979, when the Shah was there, Iran was our big buddy. Iran was a much bigger buddy than Saudi Arabia. Iran was seen as the pivotal part of a defense network that was designed to resist the Russians and the influence of the Russians and the Soviets in the Cold War. And there was even a prospect of a Southeast NATO, which Iran would be the heart of that. That all changed with the fall of the Shah in 1979, when the Iranian Revolution took place. And then you had Iranian basically was a revolutionary power seeking to export its form of theocracy to other countries. So that's why you see it in Lebanon, you see it in Syria, you see it in Iraq, you see it elsewhere. Saudi Arabia is a stable country that has never had any aspirations beyond its borders. So it's never been really a threat to Israel. And it also opposes revolutionary Islam. Although it's a kind of Wahhabist conservative state, it hates political Islam. It hates Daesh. It hates the Muslim Brotherhood. It hates Al-Qaeda with a vengeance. And therefore, it's structurally aligned with Western interests, which is to oppose terrorism, political Islam, Shia theocracy. All of these are fundamental Western interests. So Saudi Arabia kind of sits right in the center of an alliance structure or a structure of interests. So that kind of explains why Saudi Arabia, although culturally very different from us, is such a friend of the West, and Iran is seen as such a threat.
Can I just come in on a point there? But the Saudis themselves do suffer, I think, from an inferiority complex when it comes to the Iranians, and their greatest fear or concern is, if a deal is reached, then we will draw close. I mean, the UK or the US would ultimately forget the Iranian regime, but would be much more inclined to draw closer to the Iranians per se, and then not drop the Saudis, but they would become a secondary partner. And certainly in conversations with Saudis, not younger generation, there's always been this fear or concern.
I mean, when I was head of Middle East department, I used to deal with the Iranians. The Iranians always used to say, "You British, you don't treat us with respect. You don't understand the depth of our civilization over thousands of years." And I used to say to them, "Yes, instead you want to be in bed with those camel herders across the Gulf." That's what they said. They were completely rude about the Saudis. You prefer to be in with those camel herders across the Gulf. And when I tried to reason with them and say, absolutely, we have a profound respect in this country for all the civilizations that have grown up and been nurtured in Iran and all of that. And then we were talking past each other. What the Iranians were actually saying was, you don't respect our right to be the regional hegemon. We should be, everything that happens in the Middle East should come through Tehran. And that's what not that we didn't, because we have loads of scholars and lots of people who great experts on the Sassanids and the Persians and the Farsi and the whole history of Iran. That's not what they were saying. They were saying, we are the dominant power. You need to accept that. You need to deal with us. Why are you in bed with these camel herders? So there's a kind of, as you say, and the Saudis do suffer a little bit from that inferiority complex. I think it's why. This is be interesting for Nicholas. I think it's why they're beginning to, there's a great film that's just come out, The Arabian Renaissance, which is the story of archaeology in Saudi Arabia, which takes us back to the pre-Islamic era, which is something the Saudis wouldn't have done many years ago. History in Saudi Arabia started with Islam. Now they're beginning to promote all the stuff that happened before, the first humans coming to Europe via Saudi Arabia. And that's part of them rediscovering their deep history as opposed to just their more recent history.
Can we bring Simon Jackson up as well? I just want to, so we can bring Simon's microphone up. William, just to pick you up on that point, Saudi Arabia doesn't have clean hands necessarily with, I mean, we've talked about Yemen already, but if you think about Syria, there's been a lot of Saudi money flowing that way. And the issue is a sort of an implosion post-Iraq, isn't it? And everyone's been ready to play their hand.
Well, I'm not suggesting that all evil's on the side of the Iranians and Saudi Arabia has a big halo of goodness and light. The only difference is the Iranians are much more effective at it. They achieve a lot more with a lot less money. The Saudis pour much more money into it and achieve a lot less. So, yes, but the Saudis tend to be on the side of the people we're on the side of. So in Syria, they were anti-Assad. The Iranians were pro-Assad. In Lebanon, the West, Israel is anti-Hezbollah. The Iranians are pro-Hezbollah. In Iraq, we were in favor of a liberal democratic state that was non-sectarian. The Iranians played up the Shia stuff. So they're always on the different side from us. So it doesn't mean to say that we're always on the side of good. But the Saudis tend to be on the same side as us in most places. And they are in Yemen too. We're part of the same coalition that the Saudis support in Yemen. So when you talk about the Saudis as a strategic ally, it is genuine.
Simon, your question.
As I recall, when last time when oil was $10 a barrel, the leadership's room for maneuver was slightly constrained by a legion of some 6,000 parasitic princes who didn't mind where the purse strings were tightened as long as they still got their allowances, which even then were averaged over $1 million a year. And that meant there was I seem to remember there was a genuine fear that there wouldn't be the money required to buy the docility of the Wahhabis. So I suppose I have two questions. One, is the Legion of Princelings still a significant drain on the economy? And secondly, does peace in the Wahhabi region, which I seem to remember is the northeast, does that still have to be bought?
Either of you, who feels best qualified to answer? Let's Neil, just give you a chip, and then we'll come to William as well.
Okay, thank you. I mean, there's still a royal list, but I think the episode at the Ritz-Carlton really demonstrated there was a shakedown of who are the recipients from the state coffers, from the state funds. The New York Times has done some very interesting sort of investigative work into some of this area, and some of the wider sort of branches. I mean, 6,000 or 20,000. I mean, the numbers are just expansive and extensive. But what has happened under sort of MBS's reign, if you like, is he's really has consolidated and brought a lot of the power, authority, and the funds into the sort of the Salman branch, if you like. The only thing that he's done to sort of expand that base is he's put in place, and if one looks at the governors, the new governors or the deputy governors, a lot of them have come from the older branches of the family. He's kind of got rid of the uncles or the older cousins, and he's brought in younger generation, those in the 20s or 30s, and they will, I think, in 5 years' time, they will find themselves a recipient of this. I actually think there's a sort of almost like a recreation of what we saw 20, 30 years ago, where you've got MBS in a very strong position, and he's building out this kind of coalition of support from the family. But for the time being, that's really concentrated in the hands of a few. So those sort of princes no longer have the sort of amount of leverage that they may have done in the past.
Well, I think
What about the clerics, William? What about the clerics?
Well, I think the clerics are dealt with by repression. I mean, they've basically been told that if you don't toe the line, you'll get sacked or you'll find yourself in jail. I mean, there are, there's always been a balance. I mean, the assumption when I was sort of reporting back to London on why Saudi Arabia wouldn't succumb to a revolution, it was kind of based on this. The contract that the state would take care of its citizens. It would invest sufficiently in public goods. There's free education. There's good housing. There's good healthcare. So they invest enough in public goods so that and they have a safety net for the poorest Saudis. And they would always have the support of the religious establishment, and that would limit how far they could go on liberal reforms. They've gone further on liberal reforms than any Wahhabi religious establishment would be comfortable with. And the way they've dealt with that, it started under Abdullah, actually. Abdullah basically, if the Grand Mufti or the chief imam didn't agree, he sacked him. I remember there was criticism of something Abdullah had done. He just sacked him. MBS has gone further. He just puts them in jail. There was a whole bunch of what in Saudi Arabia would be regarded as more liberal clerics, Sheikh Al Salman and Al Auda, who's in jail under Abdullah but released. He's back in jail again. They would think themselves, moderates. We would see them as kind of on the extreme end of, certainly if you're a secular Christian like me, you would see them at the extreme end of the scale. So he's dealing with the Islamic opposition through repression. He's putting them in jail basically. And rather than buying them off. The population as a whole is buying them off by creating opportunity. That's the whole 2030 vision. So I think it's repression of the religious establishment, keep them down. Most of the population are in favour of the reforms that he's instituting. As for the royal family, well, I mean, we never quite got our head around this, but we came to the conclusion that 25% of the oil wealth gets creamed off the top and goes to the royal coffers to be distributed around. Simon talks about 6,000 princes. It's 20,000 plus now. princes who get a royal stipend. That information is never released. But that money comes off the top. The rest goes into the public budget. But the difference is that the 75% does go into public finances and does trickle down into the public sector, whether it's either through salaries of civil servants or investment in roads, hospitals. So there is I used to say in Afghanistan to President Karzai, I said, if you could get to a position like Saudi Arabia, where the leadership only takes 25% of the cake and leaves the 75% for the population, you might get somewhere. He was very intrigued by that concept. I said, the trouble here is the kleptocracy takes it all. I said, at least in Saudi, some of it goes in all the things you'd expect a government to do. But those accounts will never be open to the outside world, I can assure you.
Sir William was also ambassador in Afghanistan, just to follow up on that. Let's bring up Barbara Clark and bring her microphone up. And then I'm going to ask you another question as well, William. Can we bring Barbara up? I don't know how long it'll take us to. Well, I'll ask my question while we're getting Barbara up. Oh, we got Barbara there. Okay, Barbara, you're okay to talk now. Go on, Barbara. There you go.
Yes. My point was about the arms trade. Nobody's talking about the arms trade and the role that plays in keeping in the cozying up to Saudi Arabia, keeping them on side, both from Britain and the US. And until shale, the US was also requiring that trade to return the petrodollars, was it not?
Yeah, and William, it's pretty abhorrent, isn't it? I mean, the amount of bombs that have been dropped on people, schools targeted, the same things that we accuse the Russians of in Syria, the Saudis have been doing in Yemen. That's not something we want to be involved with.
Well, I don't want to become an apologist for Saudi Arabia, but I don't think they were dropping bombs on school deliberately. I think they were actually trying to kill Houthi fighters. But it's not been a great episode. No, but Barbara alludes to something that's pretty fundamental to the strategic relationship. It used to be the Saudis would buy all our kit and we would defend them. That was kind of the deal. They spent billions on arms purchases from the United States and from Britain and to a lesser extent from France. And they did it in almost direct proportion to how much they valued that country as an ally. So the United States was the most valued ally, so they bought more arms from the United States. And then Britain was next, and they bought more arms. So it's a good deal for us. We have no problem supplying arms to a strategic ally. It wasn't a problem until Yemen because they never fought anybody. The Saudi Arabia was not an aggressive power, never attacked anybody, had to defend itself against Saddam Hussein, defend itself against. So it wasn't an aggressive power. So we've never had this problem before. So now we've got the problem that Saudi Arabia is actually using the arms we supply to them, and they may be using them in a way that doesn't quite match our standards. So we have been spending quite a lot of time on the Saudis, helping the Saudis do proper, as we do. We weren't immune in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We were accused of hitting civilian targets, and indeed some civilian targets were hit. They were never targeted, but mistakes get made. And unfortunately, Saudis are quite new to this game, so it's taken quite a long time to get them into the right mood of targeting, not giving your pilots as much leeway as they obviously had before you could engage a target. The sorts of checks and balances that often, which I've been involved in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, the Saudis have yet to learn that art of warfare, and it has been an aerial campaign. They haven't been fighting on the ground, and when you're not present on the ground and you're attacking by air, more mistakes are made. But
Neil, just to follow up on that, I mean, the criticism of Saudi Arabia from human rights groups has been very, very strong, hasn't it?
Sorry.
Yeah. Saudi Arabia has an
criticism of Saudi Arabia's conduct in Yemen has been very strong among human rights groups.
Yeah. Yes, it has, and indeed, but a lot of it's given a lot of ammunition to a lot of people who were against the arms trade to Saudi Arabia anyway. And indeed, there is currently there's a judgment against supplying arms to Saudi Arabia because the court has ruled that the UK did not follow its own procedures. So currently, arms sales are supposed to be suspended, although I hear that some of them are still going ahead, and they must have found a way around it or something. I wouldn't like to be the head of Middle East Department at the moment signing off these arms sales, but clearly my successors have found a way around this.
We're going to have to draw this. Sorry, Barbara, go ahead. You go ahead.
Well, could I just come back, because there's the Yemen issue and the use of those armaments, but there's also the repression internally, and particularly the repression of women. But
well, the repression of women. Repression of women's I mean, the internal repression wasn't really an issue for us because they never used tornadoes for internal repression or typhoons, which is what we said though. So, I mean, in a way, our licensing policy requires us to take a decision. I say us. I left the Foreign Office many years ago, but it's ingrained. Requires the government to take an issue on what these arms would be used for. Would they be used for aggression or internal repression? And it was pretty easy to argue that a typhoon is not going to be used for internal repression in Saudi Arabia, and it hasn't been to date. But if anything, the human rights record within Saudi Arabia has got slightly better on one front. It's better for women, fewer executions, and it's slightly worse on another front where I think the political repression has probably increased. But Saudi Arabia is not the worst human rights abuser in the world we do trade with. So I kind of, I know you're not supposed to make comparisons, but I always think that Saudi Arabia gets the worst press in the world, and they're certainly not the worst.
Yeah, we've got to sort of draw this to a close fairly soon, but let's try and do some summing up. Neil, COVID-19 has hit Saudi Arabia pretty hard, but it doesn't have a huge amount of debt. The real trick really is for them is whether they can actually achieve this reform process, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I mean, they're not, as I said before, they're not going to achieve every dimension. There are 96 whatever key targets for Vision 2030. But I mean, I think I agree with William that there is a real desire to transform the country, and successive leaders in Saudi sort of looked out at the horizon, the future, and thought we have to break our dependency upon oil. But they never really had the capacity, will, or desire to push that ahead. And because of the decision-making process, it just restrained it. Now you have MBS, sort of warts and all, and he's made some terrible mistakes and absolute misadventures. But he does seem to recognize, number one, that the country really does have to shift its economic base. In order to do that, there has to be an opening up of the economy. And for that to happen, there has to be an opening up of the social space. The issue for him is that he's very happy to be driving this process, but he does not want to be challenged. He does not take challenge either from his close advisors, and most certainly not, from women who've been protesting at all. So the price or the cost is quite high for the Saudi public, but by and large, that youthful population has bought into this vision.
And William, you talked about the uncertainty in Washington. Neil also talked about MBS being able to turn upon a dime. Really, how sure can you be of Saudi Arabia's future with both those? Obviously, Trump was not going to be permanent, but MBS is probably going to be around for a long time. Yeah, well,
you can never be sure about Saudi Arabia, but anyone who's bet against them in the last 30 years has lost money. I remember when I left Saudi Arabia in 1998 the first time. The ambassadors always used to say, as they left, they would write their valedictory dispatches, which now banned, of course. But they would write the valedictory, and they would always say, because Whitehall would always say to them, but Saudi Arabia must implode at some point. There must be a revolution. There's internal contradictions. We got it wrong in Iran. We're going to get it wrong in Saudi Arabia. And we always used to say, now there's all sorts of reasons why Saudi Arabia is resilient. So when I left in 1998, I wrote a letter. I said, normally it's normal to give them 5 years. I'm going to give them 10. I said they'll be resilient for at least another 10 years. So funnily enough, in 2000, I went back in 2007. I think they were sending me back so I would be there in 2008 when it all fell apart. But when I left in 2010, I said, I'm going to give them another 10. And this was just before the Arab Spring. So here we are in 2020. I think Saudi Arabia is facing its biggest challenges it's ever faced in terms of the possibility of change. So I'm slightly less certain, but I'm still going to give them another 10. They'll still be, the system will still be in place. Whether, and I think MBS will still be there unless someone kills them, assassinates them. But 2030, there'll still be a monarchy in Saudi Arabia, and it'll still be struggling with diversification away from oil and trying to develop its tourist industry.
Wow. Well, thank you both very much indeed for that. I'm going to apologize for the lack of Kareem Fahim, but he's had a family emergency. So, but my thanks nevertheless to Neil Quilliam and to Sir William Patey for stepping in so valiantly there, impromptu as well. Thank you very, very much indeed, both of you. That's been a really, really good discussion.